I thought about the ancient, as well as greatly diminished modern belief in the afterlife, life after death. Biology is where we come from and where we're going and who we are.
Dead whales that sink to the seafloor represent a massive pulse of energy to an otherwise nutrient-poor environment, and this feast in the deep can host diverse and abundant communities of organisms. When whales first arrive at the seafloor, flesh-devouring animals like hagfish, sharks, crabs, amphipods, polychaete worms, and rat-tail fish, seen here, strip soft tissue from bone. Once devoid of flesh, bacteria begin to colonize and, in turn, bacterial grazers and others come to feed on the concentration of food that the decomposing skeleton provides.
This next segment is
a brief perspective on science and how that science fits into our larger society. So I profile an article here about what I feel may be the pinnacle of American or Western scientific endeavor, and that is the making and delivery of the mRNA vaccines against the COVID virus, shown to be 95% effective against the early and dangerous lung-infecting variant of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and effective far beyond the expectations and well known to be available to all Americans, rich or poor, and all within the incredible period of 18 months, a third of the time that many experts predicted. I then contrast that accomplishment with the work of one of our, I guess I'll say, curmudgeonly but brilliant maverick philosophers, Noam Chomsky, and his book and video Requiem for the American Dream. I originally made this contrast between these two perspectives for my California State University Sacramento class, this contrast between the accomplishment of science in the making of the vaccine and contrasting with the view of Chomsky on inequality in America. And this
dichotomy
just kept coming back to me, kept emerging in my thoughts. Point that I thought that I want to profile it here as a perspective on science and our system, our society. I use the term the alpha and the omega, meaning two vastly disparate realities of one thing that, in my mind, largely encompass the truth. So the article in the New York Times by senior science writer Gina Kolata features so much of what our society is made up of: the immigrant as well as the homegrown visionary scientists, the long and demoralizing struggle with failure in the endeavor to create the HIV vaccine, for instance, many years of failure and disappointment, the struggling and isolated postdoctoral lab technicians, the importance of openness and abandonment or the overcoming of class divisions that we do so well here compared to other parts of the world, of capitalism and inordinate wealth, of the peer review process and its critical role in science. But perhaps most of all, this article gives a perspective on that great American characteristic, that trait that my dad called hustle. It's all there. This is a word that came to me from my dad, and it's such an American characteristic. I think contrast that with Chomsky's Requiem for the American Dream. For me, a sort of 50-year summary of Chomsky's work about the increasing inequality in our society and how
extreme
inequality should be seen as unacceptable. It's best viewed on YouTube. You can search for those words, Chomsky, Requiem for the American Dream.
The responsibility of the anti-vax movement for the preventable deaths of anywhere between 100,000 and 200,000 unvaccinated Americans by the COVID virus during the time the COVID vaccines were available to every American. This is my next subject. This research from Europe in a peer-reviewed journal shows that approximately 230,000 Americans died of COVID who were unvaccinated during the time when the COVID vaccine was available. And I'm assuming that not all of those 230,000 people were anti-vaxxers, but certainly somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 were vaccine skeptics influenced by the anti-vax movement or were anti-vaxxers and then were infected and died. That is something we just don't see in the US press, do we? Now later, the variants that spread around were much less lethal. And so people are sort of assuming that this is the way it's always been, but it wasn't. The Delta variant that infected the lungs of people was lethal. And you have to realize this, that a highly transmissible and more mild variant, of course, that spread because it didn't kill people. People could still get out and be social and go to stores and then spread it. And so that's just the way natural selection is. I'll start with this hidden gem of a movie starring Chris Cooper and Chris Christopherson. It holds the dynamic of war, of emotions, really so well. It's set in the Civil War. It's not overly violent, but it really portrays the emotions so well of that part of our history, as well as the hypocrisy and the dynamic of love and war, I think, possibly as well as any movie. The first book I want to feature is Empire of the Summer Moon, about the life of Quanah Parker, the great Comanche chief who was the son of a white woman who had been captured by the Comanches at the age of 9 and then married a Comanche chief. And it's absolutely the best book on the entire dynamic of the West, of the whites coming west, my ancestors, I'm from both sides, coming west, and then the terrible fights, but also on the Native Americans and all of the different tribes and how different they were. The one thing that I need to tell you to do is just be ready for the brutality, and the guy doesn't hold back on the terrible brutality that the Comanche were, well, the whites as well, but the Comanche in many cases were inflicting on not only on whites but on the other tribes that they conquered. The what is it, Tonkawas, the Apaches especially. So that was just part of it. You'll have to just be ready for that. Skip over it or just read through it, and it's the only book I've ever read 3 times. I'm finishing it for the 3rd time. The only other book that I read 3 times was Legacy of Ashes, about it's the history of the CIA. Then the other book I want to feature is called Daughters of Kobani, and it's about the absolutely courageous and fierce Kurdish women who fought ISIS to a standstill with automatic weapons, eventually leading entire troops, both men and women, in northern Syria. The Kurdish people, of course, are spread over 3 major countries: Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, and possibly Iran. And they have not, of course, been able to create Kurdistan as a country. But this book says everything to me about what the young girls, should be reading in places like Afghanistan and Iran. Here's an excerpt from the audiobook. The author is talking about the Kurdish women, these combatants, going through the streets of a city where they just defeated ISIS.
Kept greeting the YPJ fighters as they made their way toward the center, clearing Manbij of ISIS. Mothers and daughters especially would come out into the streets. The women from Manbij would stare at them, talk with them, and sometimes hug them wordlessly, their embraces expressing more than words could about just how much they had witnessed and suffered. Znareen realized how strange it must have been for women in these villages to see female soldiers come through with braids and ponytails, carrying rifles and dressed in camouflage. It was strange enough for the Kurdish families to whom these women belonged. Znareen snapped her mind back to the moment and looked at this reed of a girl standing before her, wearing a niqab, a black veil that covered all of her face except her eyes. The girl had been savvy enough to make it this far, past two of the young women pulling security at the entrance to their makeshift base camp. "Salam alaikum," Znareen said to the girl. "How can I help you?" The girl spoke in barely a whisper. Znareen could see how much courage it had required for her to come here. "I wanted to find out how I could join you." As Znareen looked at the girl, she understood her. Of course this girl could not yet join them. She didn't look nearly old enough, and her family would have a say in her decision. But Znareen would not be one more person in her life who told her no. "Well, we would be very glad to have you and all the other girls in the village who would want to join us," Znareen said. "Maybe we could talk to your father and mother about coming to us when you are ready. We'd be very happy to have a girl as brave as you with us." The girl still did not meet Znareen's gaze, but her eyes communicated everything. They lit up and shone with a glimmer of what might be possible. The girl nodded and said little more. She didn't even give her name. But while she walked away, she turned to wave, and even raised her eyes to meet those of Znareen, who thought about her for a very long time afterward.
Hey, Millennials. I guess hell has frozen over and you're actually watching one of my memoir videos. I've got a problem with youans. The plural you, I refuse to use y'all. When I send out an email to boomers, usually on issues that we were both involved in or interested in, like climate restoration, and I write, here is a really good review of something. 90% of the time, from boomers, I get a reply, sometimes just okay or thanks, sometimes a couple of sentences. Millennials, it's less than 10% of the time I get even a okay or thanks or something. Got it. And it's always something that is of interest to them, such as a book recommendation or a website. And so can you explain? I think it was the late Jerry Rubin, the 60s guy, one of the Chicago 8 or something fame from the 60s, who said, yeah, every day I do this little exercise called getting my yayas out. He wrote that. I don't know where I read it. It might have been in one of the alternative papers way back. But he said, I like to get my yayas out. I put my feet on the ground and my fists on my bed. And I put lean my head all the way over and then completely relax. This is how I do it. And then you bend your knees and you get on the balls of your feet with your heels off the ground, and then you bounce. You bounce yourself. And it's really good for you. And I think for all those people who don't jog, I think one of the real benefits of jogging, after, of course, cardiovascular part, is joggling yourself. That is with an L in there. I think in yesterday's New York Times, I saw a headline saying, even a short jog is really good for you. It's benefit for the health. Someone takes a 10-minute jog, and then other people just walk or do sedentary exercise, and they find that jogging is good. And I think the joggling of, get this, once again, going to the microbiome, the intestinal flora, they like it. They like being joggled around, and it's good for your muscles. It's good for your stomach. You have to relax, put your head all the way down, hang it down. Your fists are holding a lot of your weight, and just bounce up and down, okay? Getting your yayas out. The Android Google Assistant voice to text for 5 years has been so bad. I do voice to text. I've been doing it for 6 or 7 years, and I've done hundreds and hundreds of long text messages and emails by speaking into my phone. And whoever is in charge there of the voice to text on Android should be sacked. I have sent probably 15 feedback messages in those 5 years. I finally just gave up because nothing has been done. But what this algorithm does is it capitalizes words that should not be capitalized in mid-sentence. Just ordinary words like love, fire, asymptomatic, chapel, cathedral, just hundreds and hundreds of words. And, I have a PhD and I've been a writer, and I just cannot send text messages. My brothers know that, they know that this is a problem and I can just send them these messages. But anyway, I just get all, I have to go back and in 7 years and thousands of text messages, thousands of words. I've spent dozens and dozens of hours going back and editing these words and uncapitalizing them. And so what they've done is the algorithm apparently takes words that are in the titles of popular books and movies, something like that, and just capitalizes them, and it's just idiotic. And then when I say best regards, Don, they spell it for the 1,000th time DAWN. And, the name DON is probably 90% of all the Dons in the world. But what do they do it? Anyway, that person should be sacked.
Hey, what made you come?
My dad always used the word hustle to talk about his football players. My uncle Bill Baker, 15 years younger than my dad, all of my life told me how dad's example of hustle was a major part of his life, in which he became a vice president of the University of California and was in charge of a budget larger than most countries of the world. There's part of me that comes from that California baby boomer 1960s culture influence that I grew up with, that embraces a contrasting and opposite characteristic of hustle and is at odds with it, that of dropping out. It was a really important part of life that I learned in the 60s and afterwards, and is a really important part of the California boomer culture. It's a response to when hustle doesn't have meaning. If there's no meaning or little meaning behind what you believe to be meaning behind what you're doing, what you're hustling for, then it becomes what we call the rat race. And there's no question that developing this vaccine for the COVID virus, of course, that involved hustle, because that was meaningful to so many of those scientists and technicians. But when hustle doesn't have meaning and becomes a rat race, then that part of California baby boomer generation of dropping out becomes really important. And this is, it's good when you know or you feel deeply that they don't have something that's meaningful. So I did this at various times, such as my long sojourn traveling around the world, and then afterwards, okay, that was the dropout part, and then I went into the hustle mode and went to University of California, Davis, and I finished and graduated in 3 years and 1/4 with with honors. Okay, and that was the hustle. Then there was after my master's degree and was part of the hustle. Then afterwards I went and did that stint in Santa Cruz, California, where I dropped out. And so these two things have been really important in my life. And dropping out does relate to that Chomsky view of the inequality of American society, because it gives us the time and the capacity to think through these parts of our own society. And if you're in the rat race, you may not have time to do that, and you may be part of the whole inequality. So these two things, hustle and dropping out, are important parts of my life. I don't begrudge the greatest generation after World War II. In the 1950s, they gave us that ethic of, both hustle and the rat race, pretty much as the only way to do things. They developed that in World War II when they saved us and the world from fascism of Nazi Germany and imperialist Japan, as well as from Stalin, and so I don't begrudge that. However, we did. The baby boomers had to discover that, rediscover that other side of the coin, the dropping out and the taking of time to do things, and it was a rebellion against the ethic of the hustle and the rat race. So I don't blame that greatest generation. It is what it is, or it was what it was.
We have been neglectful of our own history of botanical and natural medicines, the history and the traditions, not only in our own history, but those of other cultures. And we've been neglectful at our own financial peril of these things. I'm talking to the consumer here, because a big part of this is that these have to be researched. And I've touched on this a number of times in previous chapters, because I deal with it in my teaching. Because these botanicals and herbal remedies are nearly all non-proprietary. That means they can't be patented. And if they can't be patented, then our scientists who want to do this research can't get funding from the private sector. And so one of the lectures that I drilled into my students is that we have to pay attention to these things. We need to fund science research with federal funding, and then make sure that that funding goes into researching non-proprietary solutions, and that awards should be given for coming up with a solution that's non-proprietary, that actually competes with the proprietary one that can cost $10,000 a year. And there are cases where herbs and botanical solutions and non-proprietary solutions have done just as well or better at $100 per year than the $1,000 or $10,000 per year proprietary pharmaceutical. Coco, honey, get it for me. Give it to me. Give it to me, honey. Oh, good girl. You're such a good girl. Yes, you're a good puppy. Okay. You get a goodie for that. Yes, here you go. There you go, honey.
Death ain't such a big deal. Just dying is no goddamn fun.